Just so you know, this show is about scary stuff. So don't say I didn't warn you guys. And remember, don't be scared.
Episode 36. Coerced. The Buddhist Temple Murders. Some of the most depraved crimes of our time have been perpetrated by duos, sometimes lovelorn, sometimes scorned, sometimes simply angry. Codependent relationships are not new, and many true crime cases have them at their epicenter. From singular homicides to mass murders, deadly partnerships don't discriminate, just as age does not disqualify one from being a murderer. Even the worst mass murder in Arizona history was perpetrated by minors who, by all accounts, didn't seem destined for that path. Whatever it seemed to be that bound these two boys together was powerful enough to get one to follow the other into the abyss. In 1991, Johnathan Doody was 17 years old and living adjacent to Wat Promkunaram Buddhist Temple in Waddell, Arizona, and Luke Air Force Base, where his stepfather had been stationed until that summer. Jonathan's biological father had died from malaria when he was 6 years old and still living in Thailand, and his mother remarried the following year. By marrying a U.S. serviceman, Jonathan's mother all but guaranteed a life of constant travel and a feeling of always having to settle in. By the time he was a teen, Johnathan had landed in Arizona, where he reported being teased for his thick accent and somewhat imperfect grasp of the English language. He was known for just taking the abuse, doing little to stand up for himself. Even his stepfather allegedly took issue with these things, and there was screaming and belittling in the home. Between the tension at home and the bullying at school, Johnathan became a child who would turn into himself and clam up when confronted. By high school, he had determined he no longer would sit by as he was ridiculed by his peers. Johnathan Doody began to focus his energy into excelling in the JROTC program at Agua Fria High School, where he met 17-year-old Alex Garcia. It was the summer before Jonathan's senior year, and the pair had formed a relationship when Alex was under his command in the JROTC. Jonathan had spent a portion of that summer of 1991 staying with Alex and his family. Jonathan's family had moved on to an Air Force base in Colorado by the end of the summer of 1991, and his parents had allowed him to remain in Arizona to complete high school. He'd also spent part of the time on his own, crashing at 17-year-old friend Rolando Raleigh Caratachea's, until Jonathan said that he didn't approve of some of his friend's behaviors and pastimes. Alex Garcia's father was said to be hard on him constantly, and Alex clearly felt that his brother was the favorite son. Nothing Alex did was good enough, he thought, and his dad seemed to be readily available with the comparisons, regardless of whether anyone asked. Alex seemed to find in Johnathan Doody a father figure, a brother figure, someone worthy of his respect who felt the same about him. The misfits fit. Their interests, their mindsets, both wanted to be tougher, not to be fucked with, and they set out to make themselves feel like they were. Earlier in the summer, before Jonathan's family moved, his younger brother Daniel had been participating in a summer study program at Wat Promkunaram, where their mother was an active member. David regaled Jonathan and Alex with tales of the beautiful and priceless treasures he said he'd seen within the rooms. David said the monks were known to be carrying large wads of cash beneath their robes, and there was word of a giant safe and many smaller ones. innocent, naive David was simply explaining the beauty and wealth he witnessed while living within the religious community he loved. He did not realize that his brother and Alex had been running simulated covert military operations in fatigues with weapons, training for an opportunity to use their freshly honed tactical skills. Think synchronizing watches and crawling on bellies through brush. So they plotted and planned. Through June and July, and in August of 1991, they felt they were finally ready. They had the necessary gear and information. They had a plan. They knew the layout and the schedule. They were going to rob the Wat Promkunaram Buddhist Temple. At first, Alex would later say, they were just going to rob it. Johnathan wanted a new car to complete his new image. The riches supposedly held within the temple would surely be able to make that dream a reality. By the time August 9th rolled around, with all of their planning done and Johnathan's family away from the temple and safe in Colorado, they set out to complete the mission. They waited until midnight when the monks needed to be inside and set out to storm the place of worship. With the already blistering morning sun settling in the east, a female temple member arrived to prepare the afternoon meal for the monks. She noticed there was not a soul outside, no monks tending the irrigation in the gardens or shuffling about the grounds. No members around. Literally, not another soul was in sight as the devotee drove up the dusty road leading to the temple on the horizon. As she settled inside, still she saw no one, but as she passed by the living room area, she did catch a glimpse of a sprawl of orange robes laid out, as the monks who were in them bowed their heads in assumed prayer. It took her several seconds longer to fully absorb the unbelievable sight before her. Her monks weren't praying. The 9 residents of Wat Promkunaram who now lay dead on the floor had ended up living there in a variety of ways. The abbot, Pairuch Kantong, had come to Arizona to start the temple 3 years prior, and the 5 monks, Surachayanataru, Buche Chayarach, Chalerm Chantapim, Siang Jinjiao, and Somsak Sofa, all had varying years of service there. Alongside the 6 monks, a 75-year-old nun was murdered that night. Foy Sri Panpasert was a devotee who had come to priestly duty in her later years. Murdered alongside her was her 17-year-old grandson Matthew Miller, who was under tutelage that summer before returning to high school. The final victim that night was 21-year-old Chirasak Chirapong, who was referred to as Boy, and had returned from Thailand with the abbot recently. He was employed as temple helper. His family had sent him to Arizona to distance him from poor influences back home. Theravada Buddhists have a reputation as gentle, given more to destiny than opinion. The faith has drawn in and welcomed many a wanderer over time, and worshippers tend to navigate towards those of similar thought and practice. Such a desire for camaraderie results in Buddhist temples existing in unexpected locations. Located at the western edge of Maricopa County in unincorporated Waddell, Arizona, the temple lies about 1 mile from Luke Air Force Base in Avondale, home of the 56th Fighter Squadron and the training base for F-16 fighter pilots. Temple residents and members have gotten used to the sights and sounds of jets screeching across the desert sky, each members of their own communities coexisting within the larger community. Given the generally docile nature of devotees, monks and nuns especially, it should come as no surprise that the Buddhists didn't appear to have resisted. All 9 victims seemed to have followed their murderer's instructions, simply standing up from whatever task was at hand, filing into their own living room, and lying down on the floor as they watched and listened to their sacred home being ransacked, and waited to be murdered. Only one had a defensive wound to the arm, as if at the very last moment he raised it in an attempt to deflect the bullets aimed at his head. It was August 10th, 1991. As an unincorporated area of Phoenix, Waddell was serviced by the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office, then overseen by Sheriff Tom Agnos, an elected official. When informed of the massacre, Sheriff Agnos was actually recovering from heart surgery. Unable to physically oversee any portion of the investigation himself, he turned the reins over to his top 2 homicide detectives, who formed a 66-member task force. Day-to-day operations were assigned to Russ Kimball, and the task force quickly ballooned to more than 200 sworn peace officers, civilians, and volunteers. Wat Promkunaram was a crime scene for 6 days and was returned to its congregation on August 16, 1991. Members not only had to clean and renovate their ransacked property, but prepare memorial services for their slain brethren. The new abbot had arrived by then from California, and Winai Buncham quickly set to work with other members, undoing the visible damage. He had known the murdered abbot in their younger years. They had trained together and spoken often in the years since one had been placed in California and one in Arizona. Not only was there damage done by the intruders in their haphazard search for valuables, but the damage made by police in their determined recovery of evidence required attention as well. Evidence such as military-style boot prints, 1,000 fingerprints, and a section of wall that had been cut out, intended to shield the public from what had been carved into it. It was apparent that 2 weapons had been used in the murders. Each of the 9 victims were shot 2 to 3 times in the backs of their heads as they lay face down with their hands above their heads in prayer, waiting their turn, all killed with the same weapon. Birdshot had struck a few victims, but none had been killed by the 4 seemingly haphazard shotgun blasts. The state lab quickly determined that the murder weapon is a .22 caliber Marlin rifle. At this intersection of military families and more rural communities, the task force knew that they were about to be seizing a lot of weapons. Luckily, however, the Marlin was relatively new at that time, and only a few hundred had been manufactured to that point. Investigators began alerting surrounding law enforcement agencies to be on the lookout for Marlin rifles and to seize any for possible involvement in the Temple murders. Although the word Bloods was carved into one of the walls inside the crime scene, task force members said they didn't actually suspect the notorious street gang, as experts did not know the organization to identify themselves in this way. They did, however, receive a call to their tip line suggesting possible connections to Thai gang activity. Although no connection to any kind of smuggling or drug trade was ever established in this case, and no traces of drugs were found at Wat Promkunaram when searched. In the month following the massacre, 509 leads were investigated. The gang angles were scrutinized to no avail. All fingerprints had been matched to legitimate sources. The profile compiled by the FBI had brought them no closer to suspects or motives or even persons of interest. But all that would change on September 10th, 31 days and 509 leads after the slaughter at Wat Promkunaram. Lead 510 was a phone call from the Office of the Special Investigator at Luke Air Force Base. The call to the task force was initiated by the request for any Marlin Rifles officers in the Phoenix metro area may have come across. Historically, military police at Luke weren't included in the immediate list of local law enforcement agencies that the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office shared information with. Therefore, it took a few extra days for Luke police to be notified of the search for Marlins, triggering an officer to search back through recent reports for any mention of them. Upon doing so, the officer saw reports dated 10 and 11 days after the Temple murders, referencing teens loitering on base with a .22 Marlin. Sergeant Kimball dispatched Detective Rick Sensabaugh to find the gun, which belonged to Johnathan Doody's former roommate, 17-year-old Raleigh Karatachea. Johnathan Doody was actually present both times the MP stopped Raleigh on the grounds of Luke Air Force Base. The first time, they were in separate cars and Johnathan pulled up behind, as Raleigh was pulled over for suspicious activity. The Marlin was clearly visible. The next day, both boys were in the same